Under the auspices of an American religious foundation in October 2008, I had a public debate in Oxford with a Christian apologist, an Irish mathematician called John Lennox. A couple of days later, the same John Lennox went up to Scotland, to Inverness, where he spoke to a large audience, and he quoted the recent Oxford debate with me.
But finally, and this